Welcome, traveler. Tonight we begin with the brutal life of a knight. Sounds weird, right? Knights were glorified and worshipped in medieval times. But it was all fake. The truth is, being a knight seriously sucked, because let me tell you, the enemy sword hitting your armor is the best thing that happens to you. Ah yes, the dream job. Big sword, shiny armor, respect, nobility. You think becoming a knight means standing proud in tournaments, getting applauded by peasants, and occasionally rescuing a damsel with great hair. No. What it actually means is dying in the mud, wearing 55 pounds of metal, while your guts leak into your chainmail and a horse you can't afford kicks you in the skull. Being a knight in medieval Europe wasn't a fantasy. It was a punishment with marketing. And if you're already imagining yourself looking cool in a joust, congratulations. You're either concussed, bankrupt, or dead within 3 years. Let's start with the training. You don't just walk in and pick up a sword. You start at age 7. 7, while your modern child self was playing Pokemon. A medieval page was scrubbing armor, memorizing church Latin, getting whipped for bad manners, and being used as target practice for older squires. If you mess up, your noble sponsor might send you back to your father's manor, if he has one, or dump you in a monastery and call it a day. By 14, you're a squire. That means you're responsible for brushing a full-grown warhorse's teeth, oiling every link of a chainmail shirt that weighs more than your uncle, and possibly dying in battle before you're even knighted. Training ends when your body gives out or someone says you're ready, which are usually the same moment. And don't get too attached to that shining armor fantasy. Armor is expensive. Custom fit. Riveted steel plates don't just fall from the sky. You need a patron, or rich parents, or a kingdom stupid enough to loan it to you before sending you to a war they're already losing. Once you're fully geared up, you're less warrior and more walking oven. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't bend. You climb onto a horse, sweat instantly, and if you fall off mid-battle, congratulations, you're a dead turtle on its back. Oh, and that armor, if it dents too hard, it caves into you. Enjoy your new favorite game, internal bleeding. Let's talk war. It's not a heroic clash of good and evil. It's mostly siege duty, starvation, dysentery, and sleeping in a wet field while your feet rot inside your boots. You don't gallop in screaming heroic one-liners. You sit, for weeks, outside a castle, waiting for someone else to die of plague before you get a chance to use your sword. Most of a knight's job isn't combat. It's boredom, then fear, then mud, then trying to sleep in a puddle next to your half-frozen horse while rats chew through your baggage. Maybe you get to fight, but if you do, you pray you die quick, because if you're captured, you're either ransomed or slowly deconstructed for parts. Also, let's get one thing straight. You're not special. Knights are everywhere. By the high Middle Ages. By the 1300s, it's so overcrowded with wannabe warriors that knight doesn't even mean elite anymore. You're basically a heavily armed middle manager with a high chance of dying of tetanus. Nobles start selling knighthoods like cheap titles. So congratulations, your status symbol is now available at bulk rates to anyone with a cousin on a battlefield. Prestige? Gone. You're a glorified thug on horseback, and if you're not noble-born, you're cannon fodder. Except there are no cannons yet, so just regular fodder. You also get to live by the chivalric code, which sounds nice until you realize it's a PR stunt invented by poets and monks. Chivalry tells you to protect the weak, honor the church, and be noble in all things. Meanwhile, you're torching villages, trampling peasants, and collecting severed ears as trophies. Knights were enforcers of elite power, not gentle role models. You followed orders, you obeyed your lord, and if that meant burning down a convent because the bishop got insulted, so be it. Just hope the chroniclers write a poem later so it all sounds holy. And then there's death, not the noble kind, the dumb kind. You trip on stairs in armor and snap your spine. You drown in a moat because your helmet fills with water. You bleed out because the local healer puts vinegar in your arrow wound and slaps a goat bladder on it. There are no pensions, no trauma counseling, no legacy unless you're lucky enough to have a bard lie on your behalf. Your most heroic moment might be dying off screen while your squire runs away with your boots. That's the medieval knight's real legacy: exhaustion, infection, and maybe a shallow grave with your name spelled wrong. So you made it through your page years without crying in public, survived squirehood with only minor burns and psychological damage, and now you're a full knight. You've sworn your oaths, kissed a sword, probably haven't bathed in 3 weeks, and now it's time to fight. This is what you trained for, right? Years of drills, mounted combat, sword technique, lance handling. You were forged in sweat, discipline, and bruised ribs. You're ready for anything, except apparently not, because the first guy you fight isn't another knight. It's a shirtless farmer with a sharpened hoe, and somehow he wins. See, that's the thing no one tells you. You trained for formal combat. You learned how to joust, how to duel, how to obey the rigid choreography of tournament fighting. What you didn't learn is how to react when a peasant hurls a rock at your head and then tackles you into a dung pit while screaming about taxes. Your armor is heavy, your visibility is garbage, and your sword? It's great for stabbing another knight, but terrible in close quarters when you're getting smacked in the knee with a spade. And this guy doesn't fight fair. He's not supposed to. He's not trying to win honor. He's trying to not die. It gets worse when you realize the battlefield isn't a nice grassy plain like in the tapestries. It's a churned up mess of mud, horse droppings, and dead bodies. You can't get footing. Your armor clogs with filth. The sun's in your eyes. You're sweating buckets. And that same peasant? He just ran off with your sword. You fall back, gasping, and look around for help, only to see another knight being pulled off his horse by 3 angry millers. One of them has a sickle. This is not what the training scrolls prepared you for. This is a riot with farming equipment. Even when you do face another trained knight, it's not a clean fight. There's no slow-motion gallop with inspirational music. It's grunting, cursing, hacking at each other like carpenters with a grudge. You aim for joints, for the armpit, for anywhere the armor gaps. It's not noble. It's not beautiful. It's exhausting. And if you're lucky, your sword doesn't snap halfway through. If you're unlucky, the other guy's got a flanged mace and isn't feeling poetic. All your careful technique goes out the window the moment someone hits you in the face with 20 pounds of iron. But somehow, even this brutal chaos was survivable if you could afford it. Because armor didn't just protect, it advertised. A peasant in rags dies quietly. A knight in bright heraldry dies loudly and gets noticed, which means he also gets targeted. If you looked expensive, enemies tried harder to kill you. Or worse, not kill you. They tried to capture you, strip you of everything, and ransom you back to your lord. That's if they didn't just keep your shiny gear and dump your body in a ditch. So yes, that armor made you safer. It also made you a walking loot box. And if you're thinking, well, at least I had a horse, think again. Those war horses weren't just props. They were trained, aggressive beasts, fast, tall, and expensive. You didn't just hop on and ride. You trained for years to even stay upright during a charge. And once you fell off, because you always fell off, that horse wasn't waiting around for you. It bolted. And now you're alone, 30 pounds heavier than anyone else on the field, struggling to stand in wet chainmail while someone with a pitchfork decides whether to poke or rob you first. So yes, you trained for years. You ate stale bread, recited codes of conduct, practiced lance technique until your fingers bled, and all it took to end you was a farmer with good timing and a bad attitude. Because being a knight wasn't about being the best. It was about surviving long enough to swing something sharp in the right direction. And half the time, not even that worked. Welcome to chivalry. Here's a fun little reality check. As a knight, you are not the most valuable thing in your life. That honor goes to your horse, not your sword, not your training, not even your noble bloodline. Your giant, high-maintenance, hay-vacuuming warhorse is worth more than you. It's faster, more intimidating, and better fed. You're a man in a tin can. It's a four-legged tank with hooves. In medieval warfare, it doesn't happen without the horse, which is why every ounce of care, food, warmth, and grooming goes to the animal that might not even like you. These weren't regular horses. They were destriers, specially bred for strength and temperament, big enough to carry your armored bulk into battle, aggressive enough to trample infantry, and expensive enough to bankrupt your family twice. Keeping one alive through a winter could cost more than feeding your entire household. While your stable hands threw spoiled barley into your soup, your horse was chewing on imported oats and getting its mane brushed like royalty, and God help you if it got sick. Because a knight without a horse isn't a knight. He's a slow, heavy man, waiting to get hit. You, on the other hand, weren't guaranteed anything. If you're lucky, your noble household provides food. If not, you scrape by on battlefield rations. Hard bread, thin broth, salted meat so tough, it doubles as armor patches. Some days you skip meals so your squire can eat, or more often, so your horse can. You start treating it like a jealous sibling. While you're tightening your belt for the third day in a row, it's chewing luxuriously, practically smirking. You sleep on the floor. It gets straw. You wash in cold water. It gets brushed, oiled, cleaned, hoofed, shoed, and spoken to like a beloved heir, because in a way, it is. And don't forget, your relationship with this animal isn't romantic. It's a business partnership, and a fragile one. A destrier wasn't bred for affection. It was bred for stomping things to death and not panicking when people screamed. You had to train it hard, hours every day, months on end. Teach it to run into combat, dodge spears, respond to signals, even when chaos was breaking loose. One wrong cue, and you're either thrown off, trampled, or dragged by your own stirrups while your horse gallops into the woods without you. You've never known true humiliation until your 1,000-coin warhorse decides to bolt during a skirmish, and you have to explain to your lord why you walked home. Owning a horse also meant owning the costs. Shoeing, feeding, shelter, armor, yes, armor for the horse. If you were wealthy, your horse had better protection than your infantry. Barding made of chainmail, padded cloth, and occasionally plate, not for your squire, not for your peasants, for your expensive animal that might die from a poorly aimed spear before you even draw your sword. And guess who gets to carry that armor when you're marching on foot? Your squire, or you, because horses were for charging, not for casual strolls. When winter hit, you had to choose between keeping the fire going and keeping your horse alive. Wood was scarce. Feed was expensive. Blankets were rare. You could throw on a ragged cloak and curl into a stone corner, but your horse, it needed care. It needed stabling. It needed hay and mash, and someone to walk it so its legs didn't seize up. And that someone was often you, stumbling through snowdrifts at dawn while your own hands went numb. You couldn't afford to lose your destrier. It wasn't just your ride, it was your military career. So yes, knights were warriors, but they were also full-time horse caretakers with a side job of dying in battles. And if you thought being nobility exempted you from all that mucking, feeding, brushing, sweating, and praying, you're dead wrong. You served your horse more faithfully than your lord. Because in medieval warfare, a man was just meat in a helmet. The horse was the real knight. Let's talk about the armor. The shining symbol of your chivalric identity. That proud suit of plate and chain that supposedly made you a walking fortress. Movies love to show it polished, glowing, gleaming like a holy relic under a cathedral window. What they don't show you is what it smells like after 10 hours in the sun, 3 weeks in a wet tent, and one too many days of dry blood, sweat, and regret baking into the armpits. Spoiler alert, it's not lavender and roses. Your armor smells like boiled socks soaked in despair. You don't wash armor. Not properly. Not unless you're wealthy enough to have someone else do it. And even then, It's not like you can just dunk it in a bath and scrub it with lemon zest. Steel rusts, chainmail rusts faster. So what do? You wipe it, maybe, with an oily cloth, occasionally, but mostly, it just accumulates. Grime, dirt, battlefield fluids, and your own internal ecosystem of misery. The padding underneath, the gambeson, is even worse. It's a thick quilted linen coat that soaks up every drop of sweat like a medieval sponge and then never fully dries. You sleep in it, you fight in it, you sweat buckets into it, and it rewards you with the distinct aroma of mildew and old death. And the best part? You can't take it off easily. A full suit of armor isn't a jacket. You need help getting into it. That means you're stuck in your own stink for hours, sometimes days. You march in it, you ride in it, you fight in it. Sometimes you bleed in it and never get around to cleaning that part out. The lining rots, the straps break, the armpits become ecosystems. People avoid standing downwind of you, and you avoid lifting your arms because you're not entirely sure what's growing under there anymore. The smell becomes part of you. At some point, you stop noticing it, but everyone else still does. Now imagine trying to sleep in that. Not just wearing it all day, but bedding down in it because the camp isn't safe, and getting undressed takes too long. You lie on your back, because rolling over sounds like dragging a barrel of iron across gravel, and you try not to suffocate on your own funk. The armor clinks with every movement. Your gambeson sticks to your skin. You itch constantly, but you can't reach anything. And the lice? Oh, they love this arrangement. They move in like it's beachfront property. Some knights would shave their heads just to reduce the infestations, but guess what? Lice don't care. They'll take your beard, your eyebrows, your chest hair. You become a mobile zoo. Let's not forget heat. Armor doesn't breathe. In summer, it's a death trap. You can't sweat fast enough to keep up. People have collapsed in it before ever seeing combat, just from marching too long in the sun. In winter, it turns into a refrigerator, especially once it gets wet. Ever worn freezing metal on your skin in the snow? Imagine doing that for hours while swinging a sword and dodging arrows. The cold seeps into your bones. You don't just feel miserable, you become it. Armor amplifies the worst of every season. But even when it worked, armor wasn't invincible. A good arrow, a lucky spear thrust, a hammer blow to the shoulder, all of that could dent, crack, or punch through it. And once that armor caved, it didn't just injure you, it trapped you. Broken plate could fold inward, stabbing you while you tried to breathe. A dented helmet could blind you. A mangled gauntlet could crush your hand. You weren't protected, you were just buried alive in steel. And if you went down in battle, good luck getting back up. Armor turns you into furniture. So next time you picture a knight riding into battle with his armor glinting in the sun, add the smell, add the heat, add the chafing, add the slow realization that your beautiful steel suit is also your coffin, your prison, and your personal biohazard. Knights didn't just fight for honor. They fought because standing still in that thing for too long meant dying in your own sweat and filth. If you think knighthood was all jousting and saving maidens, let's fix that. Being a knight wasn't about charging into glorious battle while angels hummed softly in the background. No, most of your time was spent being the medieval equivalent of a mop, sent in to clean up after some noble's bad decision. You didn't choose the fight. You just showed up when your lord snapped his fingers and said, "Ride out, do violence, and don't embarrass me." Glory? Maybe. But mostly you were just damage control with a sword. Your lord picks a feud with the guy in the next county over. You're summoned, not to negotiate, not to settle it with words. Your job is to ride over and burn something until he changes his mind. Maybe that something is a village. Maybe it's a granary. Maybe it's the sheep pen belonging to some guy who's never even heard of your lord. Doesn't matter. You go where you're told. You torch what you're pointed at. You kill who gets in the way. If the villagers scream, that's normal. If they fight back, now it's rebellion, and you've got an excuse to wipe out the whole place, and you'll be praised for it later, assuming anyone writes it down with the right spin. Even your downtime was filled with someone else's dirt. Your lord needed escorts, hunting companions, tax collectors, bodyguards, and strong arms to stand behind him at court so he didn't look weak. That meant you, in full gear, sweating through your wool, trying not to yawn while some bishop explained land rights in Latin. You weren't a noble in your own right. You were a muscle suit, an ornament with a sword, someone to nod grimly when your lord said justice and then beat the tar out of whoever got labeled a bandit that week. And speaking of bandits, let's just say the line between knight and outlaw was more of a suggestion. You raided enemy territory. Brave. You raided too far. Suddenly you're rogue. You punished rebellious serfs. Heroic. You punished the wrong village. Oops, war crime. But none of it really mattered as long as your lord approved. So you did what you were told, cleaned up the mess afterward, and hoped no one wrote a poem blaming you when it all went sideways. If the war failed, if the land didn't get conquered, or the money didn't come in, guess who took the fall? You. And don't think you got paid well for this. Nobles were notorious for promising rewards and forgetting to deliver. You risk your life, lose a few teeth, maybe even save the whole bloody estate, and you're lucky to get a half-rotted pig and a thanks you can't eat from the Lord's steward. If you complained, that wasn't honorable. That was ungrateful. Real knights don't fight for coin, they'd say. Except, of course, you still had debts. Horses to feed, armor to repair, a squire who kept eating everything and growing taller. So yes, you fought for coin, and no, you usually didn't get it. Worse, when the fighting was done, you got to stick around for the glorious aftermath, rebuilding what you helped destroy, holding down newly conquered land, guarding miserable castles full of miserable peasants who hate you. You were stationed in mud fortresses with leaking roofs and no food, while the local lords spent your pay on hunting dogs. You were expected to keep peace among villagers who just buried their sons because of your last noble campaign. You were hated, resented, ignored, and still expected to smile and wave at Mass on Sunday like everything was fine. So no, you weren't a hero. You were a human cleanup crew with a sword. You went where you were told, did what had to be done, and hoped the priest gave you a nice burial when the job finally killed you. That's what glory looked like for a medieval knight. Blood on your boots, dirt in your teeth, and a legacy no one bothered to spell correctly on your grave. Congratulations, you've been knighted. You've spilled blood, followed orders, starved a little, smelled a lot. Surely, by now you get a reward. A nice patch of land, maybe a small manor with sheep and a wife and your name on something carved in stone. Right? Wrong. You don't own anything. Not the dirt you bleed on, not the castle you defend, not the house you sleep in, not even the field you buried your horse in. You're not a landowner. You're a renter with a sword, and the rent is paid in loyalty, death, and pretending to enjoy church feasts next to people who've never seen battle. See, in theory, knights are landholders. That's the whole feudal pitch. Fight for your lord, and in return, he grants you a fief. Except grant is a slippery word. What you get is a loan, land that isn't really yours, but you're expected to protect it like it is. You can't sell it. You can't build anything without permission, and if your lord dies, remarries, or gets angry, it's gone. So is your income, your home, and any future you had planned. You're a caretaker with a title and none of the rights. Land, in the medieval sense, is a leash, and guess who's wearing the collar? And while you're managing this borrowed patch of mud, you're expected to be the local hero, tax enforcer, amateur judge, grain counter, and full-time soldier. You spend half the year marching with your lord, and the other half making sure the local peasants don't starve or revolt. You're not farming. That's beneath you. But you're responsible if the harvest fails. You're not building. That's for serfs. But you better show up with stones and laborers if the road collapses or the manor leaks. It's your land, they say, until it's not. then it's your problem. Don't forget tribute. You owe your lord military service, and not just you, you're expected to bring knights with you. So now you're hiring men, training them, feeding them, and dragging them to battle. If they die, that's on you. If they steal from a monastery, still you. If they embarrass you in front of your lord, guess who gets demoted? You don't command an army, you babysit one, and they know it, because they're knights too, and none of them are thrilled about the unpaid overtime. Even when you do everything right, when you fight bravely, manage your land well, pay your dues, say your prayers, you're still one bad year from losing everything. A famine hits, you sell your horse. A neighboring baron gets jealous, suddenly your fief is contested, and you're in court trying to prove it was really yours. Spoiler, it wasn't. Everything you have depends on someone else's goodwill, and medieval lords weren't exactly famous for their fairness. The wrong alliance, a failed campaign, or a change of royal mood, and you're back to being just a guy with a sword and a debt. Meanwhile, the real landowners, the barons, earls, bishops, they're building stone castles, hosting feasts, marrying into money, and sending you off to do their dirty work. They don't patrol the borders. They don't sleep in drafty guard towers. They don't miss their child's birth because they were summoned to siege duty. You do, because you're useful, expendable, and easier to replace than to reward. You're not nobility, you're nobility adjacent. A status prop that bleeds well and complains quietly. So yes, you're a knight, but you're also a tenant, a glorified servant with nice boots and a tabard. You ride for a lord whose name is carved into walls, while yours is scratched into the back of a ledger somewhere. You don't own what you fight for. You rent it with blood. Knights are supposed to have squires, loyal young lads who fetch swords, polish armor, and maybe look up to you like some kind of muddy, dented hero. That's the myth. The truth is, your squire is usually a half-trained, sleep-deprived teenager who barely knows which end of the horse to feed. He's not a prodigy. He's not a page boy from a noble romance. He's a walking checklist of medieval chaos, underfed, overworked, and one snapped strap away from accidentally getting you killed. You don't get a polished assistant. You get someone who was shoved into training because their parents owed someone a favor or couldn't afford to feed them. They were told, go be a squire, it's an honor. Which it sort of is, if you consider honor a polite word for labor. Your squire is up before you, sleeps after you, eats less than you, and still manages to be late half the time because he's also helping 3 other knights who can't remember his name. He's the one boiling your water, brushing your destrier, oiling your chainmail, drying your socks, and then getting yelled at when your sword grip still smells like wet mold. And the kid's probably 14. 14. Not a grown man with battle experience. Not someone who's seen combat. Just a boy who's trying not to pass out while lugging your spare armor across 10 miles of mud and frostbite. You expect him to know the names of every piece of gear, anticipate every move, and maybe even stand by your side when things get rough. Meanwhile, he can't grow a full beard and still flinches when a rooster crows too loudly. And yet somehow, this child is the closest thing you have to reliable support. Of course, it's not his fault. No one trains these kids properly. They're thrown into noble houses, given a wooden sword, and told to shut up and watch. The lucky ones get mentors. The unlucky ones get trauma. They sleep in the stables, eat whatever's left over, and if they get sick, too bad. There are 3 more boys waiting to take their place, and yes, a lot of them quit, or die, or vanish into the woods and become someone else's bandit problem, but the ones that stay, you depend on them more than you'd like to admit, especially when you're on campaign. Out there, your squire is the only person who knows where your things are, how you like your gear packed, or which side you favor when mounting your horse. He's the one patching holes in your gambeson while you sleep, finding clean water, and making sure your rations haven't turned into fungal soup. And when you take a spear to the thigh, he's the one who drags you to shelter and prays you don't bleed out while he figures out which herbs don't kill people. He's your lifeline, but also, again, 14. And the best part? There's no gratitude. Squires weren't praised. They were invisible. If they did their job well, they were ignored. If they messed up, they were beaten. And yet, after years of this, the hope was they'd eventually become knights themselves. That was the prize. That after years of carrying buckets, lancing boils, and wiping blood off someone else's helmet, you too could get your own squire and start the cycle of exhaustion all over again. It's not advancement, it's inheritance of misery. So while people picture knights as these lone, heroic figures standing tall on a battlefield, the reality is that behind every knight was a teenage kid holding a piss bucket, trying not to cry, and wondering how much longer until he was the one being skewered for someone else's glory. It wasn't a partnership, it was a hierarchy of desperation, and the only thing more tragic than your squire's life is the fact that he probably still looked up to you. Chivalry, that noble shining code. The things school books talk about like it was the medieval version of a superhero oath. Protect the weak, defend the church, respect women, uphold justice. Sounds amazing, if it weren't a complete PR stunt. Chivalry in practice was less about honor and more about power management. It told knights how to behave, not kindly, but effectively. And it mostly applied when you were around other knights. If you were a peasant, a woman, a heretic, or just in the way, that code of honor turned into a polite excuse for robbing you in broad daylight. See, the chivalric code was written by monks and poets, not actual knights. They weren't on the battlefield. They were in quiet rooms with ink-stained fingers, imagining what nobility should act like. Real knights were too busy trampling fields and collecting taxes. Chivalry said you should protect widows and orphans, but it didn't stop you from burning their house down first, if they didn't pay rent. It said you shouldn't attack unarmed opponents, unless of course they were hiding in a rebellious village, at which point fire and steel were apparently chivalric tools of moral correction. And those lofty ideals, they only mattered when someone was watching. You didn't duel honorably in a field just because the code said so. You did it because the chronicler was nearby and your lord needed good press. Off the record, knights murdered prisoners, broke truces, and looted churches. The only real rule was this: don't get caught being dishonorable in front of the wrong audience. As long as your crimes came with a hymn, a donation, or a half-hearted confession afterward, they could be washed away. God forgives, especially when you bring him a new altar cloth. Let's talk courtly love, that flowery idea that knights pledged themselves to noble ladies, wrote poetry, and nobly suffered in silent longing. Reality? Knights were often thugs in expensive armor, who used love as a justification to pressure noble women, break into households, and start duels over imagined slights. It wasn't romance. It was ego warfare, wrapped in rhyming couplets. A lady's scarf tied to a lance wasn't a symbol of devotion. It was branding. A way to say, she's mine, or at least, I'll punch someone if they look at her sideways. Even knightly generosity, giving money, defending the weak, protecting pilgrims, wasn't about kindness, it was politics. Every act of mercy had a strategic purpose. Help a church, get land. Rescue a monk, get blessed. Defend a road, charge tolls. And when there was nothing to gain, the help vanished. If a village was attacked and had no coin to offer, a knight would ride right past. Unless, of course, he felt like swinging his sword for fun, in which case, welcome to medieval justice, brought to you by testosterone and plate armor. And let's not pretend that peasants bought into this code. To them, knights were the storm, armed tax collectors, who arrived when the Lord was angry or the church needed bodies for a crusade. Chivalry didn't stop you from taking grain, conscripting sons, or leveling a town square to make an example. It just gave you fancier language to explain why you did it. I serve justice, you'd say, while dragging someone's father away for unpaid tithes. I protect the weak, while trampling a merchant's stall to make room for your lord's horse. So yes, knights liked to talk about chivalry. They wore it like perfume. Strong, expensive, and only effective from a distance. But up close, it was mostly sweat, blood, and whatever lies were needed to keep the church and the nobles happy. Chivalry was never about honor. It was about image, a weapon dressed in velvet, and the only people who believed in it were the ones not being crushed under its boots. Knights weren't expected to grow old. That wasn't the plan. The job description was clear. Saddle up, fight, serve, die, preferably in that order. The system was built around early death. You started training as a child, squiring by your teens and swinging a sword into someone's chest by 20. If you were still breathing past 30, it wasn't impressive, it was awkward. You were in a profession designed to use you up, live too long, and people started wondering why you were still hanging around taking up food and armor. Part of this was practical. The life expectancy of a knight was somewhere between soon and just after lunch. War wasn't seasonal, it was a lifestyle. There was always a campaign, a feud, a rebellion, a crusade, and knights weren't sitting in tents planning strategy. They were the front line, the battering ram, the body that hit the ground first. You were meant to charge into chaos with a sharp stick and hope God felt generous that day. If you got lucky, you'd survive long enough to do it again. If not, your family might get a goat out of it. And here's the twist. When you didn't die, the system didn't know what to do with you. You couldn't retire. There was no pension, no peaceful cottage by the sea. If you were landless, you went back to being a mercenary. If you had land, you were expected to manage it badly, because you were trained for war, not crops or taxes. And if you had neither, congratulations. You were now an aging liability with expensive tastes, failing joints, and nothing useful to contribute. The feudal world didn't need veterans, it needed replacements. Old knights weren't honored, they were pitied. You couldn't fight as fast, ride as far, or stay awake through a winter patrol. And once your hearing started to go, you were just a noisy guy in the back of the hall, interrupting the young lords with tales no one asked for. If you still had a sword arm, they might haul you out for one last siege. If not, you'd be given some half-abandoned outpost and told to maintain order until you keeled over from infection, boredom, or one too many bad turnips. It wasn't retirement, it was exile with chainmail. Even the church didn't have much use for aging knights. Sure, you could shave your head and take vows. Plenty did. It was the medieval version of a career pivot. You'd become a monk or join a military order like the Templars, but only if you still had something to offer. Old knights weren't holy by default. They were drafty, cranky men who smelled like rust and forgot where they left their swords. And while some monasteries might take you out of charity, most didn't need another mouth to feed, who thought fasting meant complaining loudly 3 times a day. And don't expect family to save you. If you had sons, they were already trying to replace you. If you had daughters, they were negotiating dowries you couldn't afford. And your wife, if she was still alive and not buried behind the chapel, was likely more worried about keeping the estate together than hearing you complain about the aching in your joints again. You weren't a romantic patriarch. You were an administrative problem. An aging knight cost money, fed no troops, drew no income, and worst of all, took up a bed someone younger could be bleeding in. So no, you weren't supposed to make it to old age. Knighthood was a candle meant to burn fast and hard. The stories of elderly warriors with silver beards and a wise gaze, those were just that, stories. In reality, the old knight was a nuisance, a ghost in his own household. Not celebrated, but tolerated, until finally, someone found a reason to send him to one last fight or one last room, and then close the door. There's no way to say this gently. You stink. Not occasionally, not after battle. Always. As a medieval knight, your personal aroma is a violent cocktail of dried blood, old sweat, mildew, damp wool, greasy hair, and horse. It's not that hygiene didn't exist. It just wasn't high on your to-do list when you spent most of your waking hours either fighting, riding, or soaking in your own bodily fluids inside 3 layers of fabric and steel. No one ever pulled you aside and said, "Hey, maybe scrub behind the ears." They were too busy trying not to pass out from standing next to you. Start with the basics. Bathing? Rare. You might wash your face with a bit of cold water in the morning. You might even strip down and stand in a river if the weather and your Lord permitted. But a full body soak in warm water with soap? That's luxury. That's feast day material. Most knights could count their annual full baths on one hand and still have fingers left over to hold a turkey leg. And let's talk soap. It's not peppermint and jojoba oil. It's animal fat, ashes and lye. Gritty, caustic, and capable of stripping paint. Use too much and you'll smell like boiled tallow. Use too little and you'll smell like what you actually are. Now add the armor. Leather straps that soak up every ounce of sweat and never dry. Wool padding under your chainmail that traps every bacteria colony like a warm, moist greenhouse. Steel plates that heat up like a frying pan in summer and freeze your ribs solid in winter. You take it off, and it hisses like it's been baking. You put it on, and everything you thought you'd cleaned reactivates a portable rotisserie of medieval filth sealed against your body. It's not just a smell anymore. It's a presence. You don't enter a room. You arrive with a warning. Blood only makes it worse. You're a knight. You fight. You bleed. Other people bleed. And you don't have a dedicated changing room between battles. You wipe off your sword on the nearest patch of grass. Maybe dab at a cut with a wine-soaked rag and keep going. Blood gets in your boots, dries in your beard, cakes under your fingernails, and somehow ends up behind your ears. Mix that with dust, manure, and your own stress sweat, and the end result is less noble warrior and more feral bear who lost a wrestling match with a pigsty. Even your clothes are working against you. You've got a linen undershirt, a padded gambeson, wool hose, and multiple layers of cloaks, belts, scabbards, and armor. None of it breathes. None of it dries. If you're lucky, you'll get a fresh tunic once a week. If not, you wear what you've got until it disintegrates or walks off on its own. And laundering? That's not your job. That's your squire's problem. And even he's started keeping a 10-foot radius between you and the laundry bucket, probably for health reasons. By the end of a campaign, you're a walking biohazard. People avoid you in the mess hall. The stable boy flinches when you pass. Dogs stop sniffing you. You can't smell yourself anymore. But that's not a good thing. That's your brain giving up. Your cloak stands up on its own. Your socks could be used as weapons. Your armpits have unionized. And still, somehow, you're expected to walk into the Lord's great hall, bow respectfully, and act like you don't smell like a battlefield latrine that's been set on fire. So when modern people imagine knights as these dashing, clean-cut heroes who ride in to save the day and charm the court, remind them of this. The real knight was more likely to cause gagging than swooning. He didn't smell like roses. He smelled like suffering. Like everything he'd fought in, rolled through, and bled on, multiplied by time and sealed in with metal. You weren't a perfume ad. You were a public warning, and no one had the guts to tell you otherwise. Being a knight meant you were part of the noble class. Sure, but don't let that fool you into imagining a life of feasts, golden platters, and perfectly cooked roast swan, delivered by dancing servants. Most of the time, you ate like a well-dressed prisoner, hunched over a wooden table with half-clean hands, tearing at dry bread and questionable meat, surrounded by people just as hungry and less hygienic. The food wasn't gourmet. It wasn't balanced. It was survival, wrapped in crust and served lukewarm, if at all. Let's start with the bread. Always the bread. Thick, dense, coarse stuff baked from whatever grain was on hand. It wasn't the fluffy white bread you see in paintings. That was reserved for the ultra-rich. Your loaf might be rye, barley, or a mix of everything, with a few pebbles for texture, because milling wasn't perfect and dentists didn't exist. Sometimes the bread wasn't even for eating. It was used as a plate, called a trencher. It sat under your food, soaked up grease and gravy, and at the end of the meal, if you were still starving or particularly brave, you ate it too. Bon appetit? Meat was the centerpiece, when you could get it. But don't assume variety or quality. Most of the time, it was tough, salted or half-rotted. Beef, mutton, pork. If you had it, it was probably boiled until it resembled shoe leather in color and chewiness. Fresh meat was rare unless you just returned from raiding someone else's livestock. And let's not forget, storage was a problem. No refrigeration, salt and smoke were your preservatives, and neither guaranteed flavor or safety. You didn't eat meat for pleasure, you ate it for calories, and then prayed you wouldn't regret it 6 hours later. Vegetables were viewed with suspicion, especially green ones. They were for peasants. Knights didn't lower themselves to cabbage and turnips unless absolutely necessary, which, ironically, was most of the time during campaigns. On the road, you ate what you found. Onions, leeks, roots, whatever could be dug up or begged from a frightened villager. And let's not even talk about fiber. You didn't understand digestion. You understood being bloated, constipated, or violently ill at inopportune moments, usually while wearing full armor in a siege trench. Drinks? Water was dangerous. Straight from the well or the stream. It could carry all kinds of delightful bacteria. So you drank ale, weak ale, but still alcohol. Morning, noon, and night. Even the kids drank it. If you were lucky, there was wine, but don't expect a vintage. Most of it was sour, thick, and better suited for cleaning armor than sipping. Sometimes it was spiced to mask the taste. Sometimes it just made you hungrier. And if you ever got drunk, congratulations. You'd now be vomiting into a bucket, made of the same wood as your trencher plate. Feasts happened, yes, but they were rare, political, and mostly for show. You didn't eat well. You ate theatrically. Giant platters of peacock, pies filled with mystery meat, sauces made of vinegar and guesswork. You couldn't identify half the ingredients, and you didn't want to. And after everyone cheered and raised their goblets, the food went cold, the trenchers got moldy, and you woke up with a hangover next to a rat the size of your boot, chewing on the remains of the goose leg. You passed out holding. So no, being a knight didn't mean luxury dining. It meant eating with your hands, wiping your mouth on your sleeve, and hoping the gristle wasn't from something that died of natural causes. You fought like a warrior, but you ate like a convict. And nobody warned you about the aftertaste. You signed up for glory, banners waving, trumpets blaring, enemies scattering in fear. What you got was endless mud, stale bread, toothaches, and the sound of someone groaning for 2 days before dying in the dirt. War, for a medieval knight, wasn't cinematic. It was mostly long stretches of sitting around, waiting for something awful to happen, then dealing with it without dying, or worse, without losing your horse. Because yes, sometimes the horse mattered more than you. Let's start with the waiting. Sieges were common, and they weren't fast. You could spend weeks, even months, parked outside some crumbling stone wall, hoping the defenders would either starve, surrender, or get bored enough to open the gates. In the meantime, your job was to hold the line, which meant digging trenches, watching for arrows, and eating food so hard you could sharpen your dagger on it. Entertainment included watching rats fight over crumbs and betting how long it would take for the guy in the next tent to catch dysentery. And when the fighting finally did start, it wasn't a dance. There were no clean duels, no one-on-one showdowns, no elegant parries. It was a screaming, smashing, frenzied panic, where your only goal was not to die in the first 5 minutes. Armor didn't make you invincible, it just made you slower. A lucky arrow, a mace to the knee, or a horse slipping on blood-slick ground could end your career or your breathing instantly, and yes, your teeth were always in danger. Even with a helmet, a solid blow could knock out molars and send metal rattling inside your skull like church bells at Easter. Then came the aftermath. If you lived, congratulations. Now go pick up your dead friends, try to find your missing gear, and avoid whatever's spreading through the camp this week. Maybe it's gangrene, maybe it's trench mouth, maybe it's something no one has a name for, but definitely smells like regret. Your wounds might get cleaned, if there's wine to spare, or they might get cauterized with a hot iron and a prayer. There were no antibiotics, no medics, just pain, time, and the hope that maggots would do a better job cleaning the wound than your squire. And don't expect hero worship. No one throws a feast for the guy who held the southern wall for 12 hours. Your lord might grunt in approval. Your fellow knights might clap your back so hard it reopens your stitches. Then it's on to the next skirmish, the next siege, the next miserable campaign, where you're once again expected to fight like a lion on 3 hours of sleep and half a bowl of cold barley mash. Battle glory didn't last. Tooth loss did. Also, your enemies weren't always faceless villains. Sometimes they were other Christians. Sometimes they were neighbors. Occasionally, they were your former allies, because someone's allegiance shifted midsummer. War wasn't about good and evil. It was about property disputes, marriage claims, and who insulted whose aunt 3 generations ago. You weren't defending truth. You were enforcing someone else's grudge with a pike and no dental plan. So if you still think war was glorious, consider this. Half your time was spent waiting, the other half surviving, and the only consistent result was the sound of someone screaming, someone rotting, or someone looting a church for bread. You didn't win wars, you survived them. And even that was considered optional. You might think that at least you had one loyal companion out there in the medieval nightmare, your horse. A powerful destrier, trained for battle, bonded with its rider, the noble beast at the heart of every knightly tale. But here's the truth. That horse, it doesn't love you. It doesn't even like you. It tolerates you the same way a boiling kettle tolerates the lid, only until it explodes. Because to your horse, you're a sweaty, shouting pile of metal that keeps getting it stabbed. First of all, war horses were not gentle creatures. These weren't the friendly ponies from children's books. They were trained for violence. They could kick, bite, trample, and throw their weight around like a drunken blacksmith. The destrier wasn't just a ride, it was a weapon with hooves. It was also temperamental, high-strung, and extremely expensive. Feeding it could cost more than feeding a family. Keeping it healthy, a full-time job. And in battle, it would either charge forward like a demon or freeze at the worst possible moment because someone's cooking fire reminded it of the last siege. You didn't just ride your horse, you strapped yourself to it with saddles, stirrups, leg armor, and reins, and then expected it to sprint across churned-up mud while dodging arrows. Meanwhile, your armor weighed close to 50 pounds, and the horse was supposed to carry you, your gear, and whatever sense of direction you had left after 3 days of marching in the rain. And when it went wrong, when it slipped, bucked, or panicked, you didn't land gently. You hit the ground like a sack of hammers, and if you were lucky, you didn't get trampled by your own backup plan. And horses didn't always survive. They were prime targets. Enemy archers knew to aim low. Take out the mount, and the knight becomes a shiny, angry turtle on the ground. You might love your horse. The enemy definitely didn't. If your horse went down, you were now on foot, outnumbered, and trying to crawl away in plate armor while your squire screamed in the distance. And even if you managed to keep the horse alive, battlefield injuries meant infection, lameness, or a slow death by infection while you watched helplessly. Romantic, right? Caring for the horse was also your responsibility. You didn't just ride into camp and toss the reins to a valet. You or your squire had to feed it, groom it, rub down its legs, clean its hooves, repair tack, and keep it from wandering into a swamp or a cook fire. And horses get sick. They get colic, hoof rot, parasites, and mysterious diseases with no names and only one cure, a sharp knife and a quiet morning. And if you couldn't afford a new one, well, enjoy being a knight on foot, No one took you seriously. If you fought without a horse, you might as well just be a peasant with better boots. Plus, horses are sensitive. Loud noises, sudden movements, changes in weather, strange smells, all of it could spook your four-legged comrade into bolting at the exact wrong time. Ever tried calming down a 1,000-pound animal with medieval dentistry and half a saddle strap? It's not graceful. It's not heroic. It's loud, humiliating, and often ends with you face first in manure, trying to remember which direction your army is marching. So no, your horse didn't love you. It didn't look into your eyes and see a kindred soul. It saw a source of discomfort, confusion, and occasional oats. If anything, it resented you for making its life more dangerous than a goat's. And deep down, you knew it, because every time it turned its head and snorted like it was judging your life choices, it was. Let's say you survive the chaos of battle. You don't get stabbed, crushed, or abandoned in a ditch. Great. But then a dozen armed men surround you, yank off your helmet, and shout something about surrender. Now comes the fun question. Are you important enough to ransom? Because if the answer is no, then your odds of walking away drop faster than your sword in the mud. Being captured wasn't the worst outcome in medieval warfare, unless you were poor. Then it was just a slower way to die. See? Knights loved ransoms. It was one of the only times medieval war paid dividends. Capture a noble with a big title? That's retirement money. You kept them alive, treated them decently, and waited for the gold to show up. But you're a third-son knight with one ruined boot and a rusty sword. You own exactly half a horse and a dented helmet with your uncle's crest on it. Your captors look at you and see zero return on investment. If you're lucky, they take your gear and let you crawl home. If not, well, you won't have to worry about ransom paperwork. The ransom system wasn't fair. It was never supposed to be. It was based on class, status, and sheer luck. High lords, barons, bishops, they were prizes. They had estates, families, and retainers who would move heaven and earth to keep them alive. You're more of a rounding error. If your squire goes missing, people shrug. If you vanish, maybe your cousins argue over your boots. The economy of capture was brutal math. How much are you worth, and how long will you stay alive while we wait for someone to care? And the negotiations weren't fast. You might sit in a wooden cage for months, shackled in some damp tower, eating stale bread and praying you don't get sold to someone worse. If you had connections, maybe your lord would scrape together something, not because he liked you, but because knights are technically expensive to train. But often, even they wouldn't bother. Lords weren't charities. If you weren't a critical asset, they might send a letter of condolence and start training your replacement before your helmet cooled. Sometimes, you could ransom yourself if you happened to carry valuables, or if you had a family back home who could sell off livestock, tools, or a decent goat. This meant sending desperate messages back across enemy lines, hoping someone even remembered you were alive. If your family failed, you'd stay in that cell until you starved, got sold to a mercenary company, or died of a tooth infection. There were no rescue missions, no midnight escapes, just cold stone and slower decay. Meanwhile, you might watch your captured enemy, some perfumed lord from the other side, get escorted out of camp under guard, placed in a cushy room, and served warm food while his ransom was being negotiated. Because he had a title, he had leverage. You had dirt under your nails and a tunic made of patched regrets. If you tried to negotiate your own release, they might just laugh, or worse, use you for practice. Archery needs targets. So yes, medieval war had a code. But like most medieval codes, it only applied if you were rich, titled, and considered worth the paperwork. Everyone else? You were expendable. If you got ransomed, it was an accident. And if you didn't, well, at least the rats in the dungeon never judged you. People like to picture chainmail as sleek, stylish armor, a cool metal hoodie that somehow makes you look both invincible and photogenic. But real chainmail? It was heavy, noisy, and smelled like wet dog and sweat-soaked pennies. It didn't glide over your body. It dragged, tugged, and punished every joint it touched. And here's the cruel joke. You had to wear it, because without it, you'd last about 3 seconds in any serious fight. You could either be uncomfortable or impaled. Your call. Let's start with the weight. A full hauberk, that's the shirt-like mail covering you from shoulder to thigh, could weigh anywhere from 25 to 35 pounds. And that was before you added a coif for your head, chausses for your legs, and mittens for your hands. Altogether, you were hauling around the weight of a medium-sized child just to survive a sword swing. It didn't sit on your shoulders gracefully. It clung, pulled, dug into your collarbone. After a day of wearing it, your back felt like someone had tried to till soil with your spine. Underneath, you didn't go bare. That would have turned your skin into a lattice of bruises and blood blisters. Instead, you wore a padded gambeson, basically a quilt made of linen, stuffed with wool, rag, or horsehair. It was thick, hot, and absorbent, which is a polite way of saying it turned into a soggy, stinking sponge within minutes of combat. Chainmail might stop a blade. The gambeson tried to stop your bones from breaking under the impact. Together, they made you look and feel like a slow-cooking stew wrapped in medieval misery. And that chainmail? It wasn't exactly high-tech. It rusted, constantly. If it got wet, it needed to be dried, oiled, scrubbed, and checked. Every single link was a liability. You might spend hours after battle trying to repair it, or worse, pass it off to a terrified squire who was already behind on your laundry. A broken link could catch on your clothing, tear your skin, or let a blade sneak through. It wasn't a force field, it was a compromise, and it aged fast. Mobility? That was the real joke. Sure, you could technically run, climb, kneel, and mount a horse, assuming you'd been training since you were 10 and hadn't eaten too much hard cheese that morning. But every movement came with resistance. Every twist of your torso reminded you of the price of protection. Stairs were awful, mud was worse, and God help you if you ever had to crawl. You'd move like an arthritic beetle, dragging a pantry on its back. But even with all its faults, you still wore the stuff, because the alternative was a blade in your ribs, an arrow in your thigh, or a mace turning your bones into porridge. Padded cloth alone didn't cut it. Leather wasn't great at stopping swords, so you endured. You wore your chainmail like a second, worse skin. You got used to the smell, the weight, the heat, the sound of every step rattling like a sack of pots, because that clatter meant you might live to complain about it tomorrow. So no, chainmail wasn't heroic. It didn't make you look like a knight from the movies. It made you smell like you hadn't taken it off in a week because you hadn't. It gave you sores, bruises, and the upper body of a desperate blacksmith. But it also let you survive long enough to find out what fresh horror your lord had in store for you next. You think armor makes you look cool? Try walking a mile in it. Better yet, try walking, sweating, riding, kneeling, falling off a horse, and sleeping upright against a barn wall in it. Suddenly that polished steel doesn't feel like power, it feels like punishment. Because armor didn't just protect you, it rubbed you raw, it pinched, it cut off circulation, it made you smell like burnt ham left out in the sun, and it never ever let you forget that underneath all that metal, you're just a sack of skin waiting to blister. Let's talk chafing. You wore a padded gambeson, under everything, great in theory. In practice, it soaked up your sweat, bunched in the wrong places, and turned every movement into slow-motion sandpaper. Your thighs, armpits, neck, and waist took the worst of it. The more you moved, the worse it got. By the end of a march, it felt like someone had rubbed your body with salt and broken pottery. And remember, no talcum powder, no anti-chafe balm, just hope, wool, and maybe a desperate prayer to St. George. The metal parts didn't help either. Plate armor had sharp edges, joints pinched, breastplates could crush your ribs if they shifted wrong. Elbow and knee counters dug into your ligaments when you bent the wrong way. Your helm, A heavy, clunky iron nightmare bounced against your collar every time you moved too fast, leaving bruises that matched the shape of regret. Even standing still didn't spare you. Just wearing armor pressed your own body weight back into your bones until your shoulders screamed for relief. Now try fighting in it. You're already soaked in sweat before the battle even starts. Your padding is saturated. Your arms are burning from the sheer act of raising your sword, and your thighs feel like they've been cooked. Every swing is resistance. Every step is a gamble. Your vision is limited, your hearing's worse, and your helmet turns your breath into steam that rolls back into your eyes. Then someone hits you hard, and all that metal slams into your bones like a drum kit collapsing. And you thank it, because the alternative is a spear in your spleen. After battle, the real horror begins. You strip off the armor and find what's left of your skin: blisters, welts, rashes, sometimes open sores. No showers, no ointment. Maybe someone pours wine on it and calls it medicine. The padding gets hung up to dry, never truly cleaned, and by the next morning, you're pulling it back on over broken skin. Infection was a constant risk, not just from wounds, but from your own gear. Fungus, bacteria, rot, all thriving in the damp crevices of your Under Armour life. And God forbid you had to sleep in it. Sometimes there was no time to strip down. You'd doze sitting up or half reclined, dreaming of warmth while your armor slowly cut off circulation to your legs. You'd wake up with numb limbs and a helmet full of stale breath. Maybe your squire tried to loosen a buckle during the night. Maybe he forgot. Either way, you spent the next morning dragging yourself upright like a medieval tin man whose oil can was wine and desperation. So yes, armor protected you, but it also punished you. It didn't feel like wearing glory. It felt like living inside a torture device built by someone who hated knees. And it reminded you, every single day, that survival wasn't comfortable. It was metal, sweat, and the slow grind of skin against steel. If you were lucky enough to have a squire, congratulations. You've got a teenage apprentice with half your experience and all of your attitude. Squires were supposed to make your life easier. Polish the armor, fetch the weapons, saddle the horse. And sure, sometimes they actually did those things. But more often than not, having a squire meant having to supervise a second, equally clueless human who was learning the art of war by accidentally hitting themselves with your gear. And every mistake they made, you paid for, in pain, delay, or humiliation. Squires were boys, usually from noble families, sent off around age 14 to start their knightly education. This meant they were old enough to carry your sword, but not old enough to understand why soaking your chainmail in river water was a bad idea. They cleaned your armor, sort of. They brushed your horse mostly, and they tried to help you suit up for battle without pinching your skin in a buckle for the 5th time that week. But they were learning, which meant you were suffering. Take mornings, for example. You'd rise aching, sore, and hungry. Your squire was supposed to have your gear ready. Instead, he's half asleep. Your greaves are still muddy from yesterday, and your helmet smells like something died in it. Did he air it out like you told him? No. He used it to carry firewood and forgot. Now your headgear is full of ash and pine needles. Your sword is still dull, your surcoat's wrinkled, and he tied your saddle on backward. Again. In battle, he was supposed to support you from the edges, bring you weapons, help you remount if you fell, maybe even drag you away if you were wounded. But that's assuming he didn't panic and bolt the first time a crossbow fired. Plenty of squires were brave, plenty weren't. And if yours happened to freeze in the middle of a skirmish, you'd better hope your backup dagger was sharp, because help wasn't coming. Knights didn't get timeouts, they got dead. And the only thing worse than being injured in armor was being injured in armor while your squire cried behind a tree. Off the battlefield, squires were your valet, your secretary, your messenger, and occasionally your cook. That sounds useful, until you remember they were also teenagers. Teenagers with too much pride, a shaky grasp of Latin, and the attention span of a gnat. Send one to deliver a message, and he might flirt with the baker's daughter for an hour before remembering what town he was supposed to ride to. Ask him to watch your horse, and you might come back to find it missing a shoe and chewing on your laundry. And yet, you needed him. Because the alternative was doing it all yourself. Polishing your armor, hauling your gear, wrapping your own bandages, sharpening your own blades in the dark after a day of riding. A knight without a squire was still expected to function like a one-man military unit. You could do it, sure, but you'd be slower, sweatier, and far more miserable. That's why even a terrible squire was better than no squire at all. Barely. So yes, squires were supposed to help. And when they did, it was glorious, like having a miniature version of yourself, only slightly less angry and slightly more energetic. But when they didn't, you ended up late to battle with one glove, mismatched greaves, a backwards surcoat, and a horse that looked like it'd been brushed with a fork. Nobility didn't protect you from incompetence, and medieval mentorship, as it turns out, often came with blisters, saddle sores, and a lot of yelling. Being a knight might have earned you a title, some land, and the right to wave a fancy banner. But it didn't get you out of the worst part of military life, the marches. Endless, bone-grinding, wet-footed, saddle-chafing marches across terrain that hated you personally. Rain, always. Mud, constant. Blisters, a certainty. And while you might not have carried a pike like the infantry, your back still ached, your legs still swelled, and you still slept wherever your horse collapsed if you were lucky. Marches weren't casual strolls through the countryside. They were military movement at its slowest and most miserable. Roads, if you could call them that, were rutted, flooded, or non-existent. Streams overflowed, fields turned to swamps, and every third bridge was either broken, missing, or controlled by some lord with a grudge and a toll fee. You rode when you could, but horses tired, stumbled, and sometimes refused to move. Sooner or later, even a noble knight had to walk. And that's when the real fun started. Imagine wearing 3 layers of padded cloth and 30 pounds of chainmail while dragging your own gear through ankle-deep muck. Your boots already stiff from the last campaign, soak through by hour 2. Your thighs start to chafe, your toes go numb, then blister. You sweat through your tunic, your gambeson, and your patience, only for the wind to pick up and remind you that yes, it's still February, and no, that smell isn't going away. Every mile is a new insult. Every step, a reason to reevaluate your life choices. Food. If you packed it, you might get a handful of hard bread, some jerky or salted fish that tasted like rope. If you didn't, you begged from the quartermaster or bartered with peasants, assuming your presence didn't just terrify them into hiding. Water was even worse. Wells were rare, rivers were risky. Most of the time, you drank whatever the horses wouldn't, and the moment you did, welcome to medieval stomach roulette. Try marching 20 miles with gastrointestinal regret and full armor. It's a full-body experience. Sleep was something you stole. You didn't camp so much as collapsed wherever there was space, under wagons, inside ruined huts, or out in the open, using your rolled-up cloak as a pillow and your helmet as a rain catcher. Fires were precious, blankets shared, and if you were near the rear of the column, you slept last, after everyone else had already trampled the ground into sludge and scared off anything edible. Nights were cold, wet, and full of noises you didn't want to identify. That wasn't a bird. That was probably someone dying. Again. And the people around you didn't make it easier. The camp stank. Feet, sweat, horse manure, wet wool, all blending into one unholy odor that clung to everything. Your fellow knights snored, muttered, or groaned through their injuries. The infantry complained loudly. The squires forgot things. The priests preached. And you stared at the sky, trying to remember why you ever thought noble warrior sounded better than quiet farmer. At least farmers slept in beds and didn't get stabbed in their sleep by mercenaries looking for boots. So yes, you were noble. You had a coat of arms and maybe a family motto, but none of that kept your socks dry, your back unbroken, or your boots from swallowing your feet whole in some anonymous field outside Normandy. Titles meant very little when your knees gave out and your nose was bleeding from cold. On the march, every night was equal, equally cold, equally filthy, and equally regretting everything. Knights were supposed to be paragons of health, strong, rugged, immune to weakness. But medieval reality didn't care how noble your lineage was. It cared whether you drank from the wrong stream. And if you did, no amount of honor would save your bowels. Sickness didn't ask for your title. It hit everyone. Kings, peasants, and the guy in polished chainmail vomiting into a ditch while trying to keep his dignity intact. Being a knight didn't keep you healthy. It just gave you more dramatic places to collapse. Let's start with the basics: food and water. Neither were safe. That feast you attended 2 nights ago, half the meat was undercooked. The wine was watered down with something that might have been pond runoff. You didn't wash your hands, nobody did. And you shared drinking cups like germs weren't even a concept yet. Spoiler, they were. And they loved medieval knights, especially the ones who marched all day, didn't sleep, and thought onions counted as a cure-all. Dysentery, typhoid, and food poisoning were just part of the package. You might be covered in armor, but your gut was defenseless. Then there were the wounds. Infection wasn't an if, it was a when. A cut from a sword, a blister rubbed raw by your saddle, all of it could spiral into fever, pus, and prayers to saints you couldn't even name. Medical help meant having your wound washed with wine, cauterized with iron, or filled with mashed herbs someone swore cured their cousin's leg rot. The concept of antiseptics? A fantasy. Most knights just hoped their immune system was better than whatever was festering inside their armor. And the armor made it worse. It trapped sweat. It trapped heat. It turned your body into a walking incubator for bacteria and fungal infections. You couldn't shower. You barely bathed. Your undergarments got changed when you had time, which meant almost never. Combine that with stress, exhaustion, and endless exposure to the elements, and you've got a recipe for sickness. Respiratory infections, boils, rashes, and lice weren't rare. They were expected. And guess what? No antibiotics. You just waited to see if you'd live. When you did get sick, really sick, you had 2 options: wait it out or die dramatically. Fevers could last days, weeks, or leave you half delirious during a campaign. No one gave you sick leave. No one brought you soup. You still had to ride, fight, and serve, even if you were coughing up parts of your lung lining. And if you fainted mid-battle, your enemies wouldn't pause for sympathy. They'd just assume you were an easy target, because you were. And yet, illness wasn't treated seriously unless it was obviously fatal. A limp, a hacking cough, or a festering wound. Just walk it off. Suffering was part of being a knight. Complaining made you soft. You didn't get time to rest. You got time to pray. Maybe you'd find a monk who'd bleed you with a dirty knife and mutter a few Latin phrases. Or maybe someone would just dump holy water on your face and call it a miracle. Either way, recovery was more guesswork than science. So no, your status didn't protect you. Your bravery didn't boost your immune system, and your armor didn't stop the plague. It just made sure that when you finally passed out from fever, you did it loudly, painfully, and with 3 squires arguing over who had to clean up after you. Being a knight meant being sick often, and still expected to charge headfirst into battle, because nothing says chivalry like vomiting between sword swings. So you made it. You've got a name, a coat of arms, maybe even a ballad or 2 sung in your honor. The other knights nod when you ride by. Squires try not to trip while handing you your helmet. You're not just surviving, you're respected. You've become what every wide-eyed page dreams of becoming. But here's the part they forget to tell you. Medieval fame was cheap, fragile, and often lasted just a little longer than your last heartbeat. Because the moment you died, especially if it was messy, people stopped remembering who you were and started arguing about how much your boots were worth. Let's be clear, fame in the Middle Ages wasn't recorded in fan mail or shiny plaques. It was passed along by word of mouth, the occasional bard, and maybe a letter from your lord if he was particularly bored that week. You were only as famous as the last person who remembered your name. Die in a noble duel? You might get a poem. Die screaming in the mud after falling off your horse into a latrine trench? That one's probably not getting immortalized. Knights didn't get movie endings. They got rot, vultures, and the distant sound of someone mispronouncing their family name. And fame was fickle. One bad turn, losing a battle, getting captured, failing to show up with your troops on time, and your reputation was toast. Lords had long memories when it came to failures and short ones for your victories. All that effort to rise above the mud, to be known for your skill, your honor, your courage, it could vanish overnight. Not with a scandal, not with a betrayal, just with an unlucky spear to the gut, in a skirmish nobody bothered to write down. Your noble death, lost in the margin between taxes and grain yields. And let's not forget that your peers were also knights. Jealous, scheming, equally desperate for status knights. If you were too successful, someone wanted your land. If you were too noble, someone wanted to test your strength. And if you were just there, quietly doing your job, someone might still challenge you in a tournament just to say they bested Sir What's-His-Name. Even in peace, your title came with targets. Everyone wanted your spot. Everyone had a cousin who thought he deserved it more, and no one remembered how you got it in the first place. Your legacy, if you even had one, depended on things wildly out of your control. Did your family survive? Did your estate stay intact? Did your squire remember to tell anyone where your body ended up? Because if not, congratulations, you just became one more anonymous skull on the battlefield, buried in a shallow grave under some lord's future vineyard. The only people who remembered you were the ones still washing your blood out of their boots, and they weren't singing songs about it. Even those who did make it into the history books didn't get to control the narrative. You might have fought bravely and died defending a monastery, but give it a century, and suddenly the stories about how you accidentally set it on fire. Truth got rewritten constantly, shaped by the people who survived, the clerks who copied it, and the drunk minstrels who needed to spice things up for the next tavern crowd. Reality? Optional. Reputation? Rental. Immortality? Only if someone needed your name to rhyme with Lance. So yes, you were famous. Briefly, locally, and with an expiration date shorter than a peasant's goat milk. The best you could hope for was a carved name on a stone that didn't get repurposed into a pig trough. Fame didn't shield you. It didn't rescue you. It just meant more people noticed when you finally collapsed, and then promptly forgot. Want to be a knight? Great. Hope you enjoy childhood ending around the age of 7, because that's when the real work starts. Not with wooden swords and bedtime stories, but with chores, bruises, cold baths, and strict tutors who care more about your posture than your emotional well-being. Becoming a knight wasn't a calling. It was a lifetime commitment, and it started when you were barely tall enough to see over the stable wall. At age 7, you became a page. That meant leaving home, possibly forever, and being shipped off to another noble household. Not because they were more loving, because it was custom. You were placed under the supervision of a lord or lady who would oversee your education, your etiquette, and occasionally your ability to survive a whipping without crying in front of the fireplace. You learned how to serve at table, memorize prayers, clean armor, carry messages, and bow correctly without falling over. You were a noble child, yes, but you were still a servant in someone else's house. You got up early, before the sun. You scrubbed floors, fed dogs, lit fires, and did whatever your master's steward needed. Then came lessons, usually Latin, some philosophy, maybe a bit of heraldry, all taught by someone who believed education was most effective when delivered with a cane. If you mispronounced your conjugations, forgot your saints, or tripped on your own sword belt, you got a correction, fast, public, and loud. Pages didn't get praise. They got shaped, like iron on an anvil. By 14, if you survived pagehood with all your teeth and a semi-functioning spine, You became a squire. That's when things got serious. Now you were training with weapons daily: swords, lances, axes, and bows. You learned how to ride in full armor, clean wounds, read terrain, and bandage horses. You also ran errands. A lot of them. Fetch water, clean your knight's gear, oil his boots, polish his chainmail, reset his tent poles, and remember to stand silently during arguments you were too young to understand. Squire meant future knight, but it also meant human pack mule. In battle, you followed your knight like a duckling with an 80-pound to-do list. You held his spare weapons, retrieved his horse if it ran off, dragged him to safety if he got knocked down. You didn't fight, not officially, but you were still expected to dodge arrows, run messages, and somehow survive long enough to graduate. And that promotion didn't come with a certificate. It came with more pain. You'd be knighted, maybe in a church, maybe on a battlefield, maybe in a tent soaked with someone else's blood. And then your real trials began. All this training wasn't optional. Your family expected it. Your class demanded it. Your lord required it. And heaven help you if you didn't take to it naturally. Not everyone did. Some boys washed out, snapped under pressure, or died during sparring accidents that were quietly chalked up to learning. You weren't allowed to be sensitive, or clumsy, or slow. You were molded from the age of 7 into something hard, useful, and replaceable. If you couldn't hack it, there was always the priesthood, or the kitchen, or nothing. So no. Growing up as a knight in training wasn't some romantic montage of swordplay and sunsets. It was relentless labor, stiff uniforms, cold dormitories, and instructors who believed that character came from controlled suffering. You might wear a sword on your hip by 20, but it took over a decade of drills, humiliation, and quiet pain to get there. Glory, as it turns out, had an apprenticeship, and it sucked. So you're finally on the battlefield. You've trained for years, earned your armor, and now you're mounted, armed, and ready to prove your worth. The wind tugs at your banner, your horse paws the ground, and your squire just tried to hand you your lance upside down. But there's a problem, a big one. You're a knight, which means you're tall, shiny, expensive, and every archer in a 5-mile radius is currently aiming directly at your chest. You're not just on the battlefield, you're the battlefield's favorite target. Let's be honest, you stand out. Knights weren't camouflaged. They wore colorful surcoats, plumes, crests, all the medieval equivalents of putting a flashing "shoot me first" sign on your head. And it wasn't just for fashion. Nobles wanted to be seen. They needed to show off their heraldry, prove their lineage, make it clear which house they were dying for. But on a battlefield, visibility comes at a price. Archers loved it. Oh look, they thought, a walking paycheck in tinfoil. Let's test our aim. English longbowmen were the stuff of nightly nightmares, firing arrows over 250 yards, piercing mail, and sometimes even plate, depending on range and angle. They could ruin your day before you ever reached them. Knights often charged through a storm of arrows, heads down, praying to Saint Michael and hoping their armor didn't have one of those awkward gaps around the armpit. If you were lucky, the arrow hit your shield. If not, we'll ever wonder what it feels like to carry a turkey skewer in your thigh while trying to stay on a galloping horse. And that's assuming you were on horseback. On foot, it was worse. You trudged across churned-up mud, breath fogging inside your helmet, hearing the hiss of arrows raining down like angry bees. You couldn't run, not in that armor. You could only push forward and hope you weren't the poor soul who caught one in the visor. Some knights didn't even make it to melee. They dropped halfway through the approach, skewered, trampled, and forgotten. All that training, just to become part of the terrain. But wait, didn't armor protect you? Sort of. Mail could stop some arrows, especially at long range. Plate helped a lot, but it wasn't invincible. Joints, eye slits, underarms, groin, backs of knees, all vulnerable. And the longer you were in the open, the higher the odds one of those arrows found a weak spot. Armor could only do so much. It couldn't stop bad luck. And it definitely couldn't stop 5,000 arrows in under a minute, which is what some battles saw. Even if you weren't hit, arrows messed with your head. You saw your comrades drop, you heard the screaming, you felt the thunk of shafts bouncing off your helm. Some men broke and ran, others froze. The best ones pressed forward through the panic, not because they were fearless, but because turning around meant getting shot in the back. You kept going because going forward was slightly less fatal than retreating. That's what strategy looked like some days. Try to die slower. So yes, knights were brave. They were elite. They were terrifying in close combat. But before they ever reached the enemy, they had to survive being glorified dartboards. Every step forward meant testing your armor, your nerves, and your sheer dumb luck against 1,000 arrows. If you made it, great. Now all you had to do was fight a guy with an axe who hadn't been standing in a wind tunnel of death. And he probably wasn't in a great mood either. Ah yes, chivalry, the legendary code of honor that supposedly guided every knight's actions. Be brave, be loyal, protect the weak, serve the church, and never ever think about stabbing someone in the back. Sounds noble, right? Until you actually tried living by it. Then it felt less like a guiding principle and more like a list of rules specifically designed to make your already difficult life even worse. Because while your enemies were throwing mud, lies, and actual spears, you were expected to fight with one hand tied behind your conscience. Let's be real, the code of chivalry wasn't exactly enforceable. No one handed you a pamphlet the day you got knighted and said, "Here's how to be a good person forever." It was a mix of church teachings, courtly ideals, military traditions, and whatever your lord yelled at you after his third goblet of wine. Protect the weak, sure, unless the weak were peasants, in which case, good luck. Honor women. Absolutely, as long as they were noble, not serfs, and preferably related to someone politically useful. And even when you tried to follow it, the code had a way of backfiring. For example, mercy. Knights were supposed to spare worthy opponents, but showing mercy could get you killed if the guy you spared picked up a rock and brained you 2 minutes later. Fighting honorably often meant fighting stupidly, refusing to ambush, giving fair warning, or letting someone retrieve their weapon before you finished them off. Great for poetry, terrible for survival. The code didn't say what to do when your enemy didn't play fair, which was most of the time. It also meant you couldn't just take the easy victories. Burning down a village to cut off supplies, technically a war crime, though your commander might reward it anyway. Starving out a castle? Not very chivalrous, but incredibly effective. Every decision became a balancing act between looking good for the minstrels and actually winning the war, and God help you if a priest was watching. Then you had to pretend like you enjoyed fasting before battle, praying instead of sleeping, and not looting the church, even if it was full of silver. And let's talk about loyalty. You were supposed to serve your liege lord with unwavering devotion, even if he was an idiot who sent you into unwinnable battles. Breaking an oath was shameful, but what if your lord broke his promises to you? Tough luck. Knights didn't get unions. You obeyed, or you risked being labeled a traitor. And once that happened, your shiny armor didn't matter. You were a pariah. No feasts, no tournaments, no safe place to sleep. Just the creeping realization that honor was a one-way street. Courtly love didn't make things easier. The idea was that you pledged devotion to a noble lady, often unattainable, and performed great deeds in her name. Sounds romantic. Until you realize you're bleeding in a ditch because you wanted to impress someone who doesn't know your full name. Chivalry demanded sacrifice, elegance, restraint, none of which helped you in a real fight. It was like being expected to write poetry while getting kicked in the ribs. Grace under pressure? Try not dying first. So yeah, chivalry sounded great at banquets. Lords toasted it. Bards sang about it. But out in the mud, with your sword arm aching and your horse half dead, it mostly made your life harder. You had to fight like a hero, live like a monk, serve like a servant, and smile while doing it. Meanwhile, your enemies just had to swing a mace. That's the beauty of ideals. They're easiest to admire when someone else is suffering under them. Ah, tournaments. The medieval version of a weekend getaway for knights. Music, flags, cheering crowds. The chance to show off your skill without the inconvenience of a real war. It all sounded like fun until the lances shattered, the horses collided, and someone's helmet flew off with part of their face still in it. Because while tournaments were entertainment, they were also barely contained chaos. A blood sport dressed up as a pageant. And if you weren't careful, they'd leave you just as broken as any battlefield. Jousting wasn't a game of finesse. It was two armored men charging at each other with 12-foot wooden poles, hoping to hit and not be hit. The goal: strike your opponent cleanly and knock him off his horse. But even when it worked, it hurt. You wore armor, sure, but blunt force trauma doesn't care about your fancy breastplate. A solid hit to the chest could break ribs. A lance to the face could shatter a visor or the skull beneath it. And if you fell, well, let's hope you landed on something soft, like more armor. And then there were the melees. Picture dozens of knights on foot or horseback, swinging swords, axes, and maces at each other in what was technically a mock battle. It was supposed to simulate real combat. It often ended up creating real injuries, broken bones, concussions, dislocated shoulders, all part of the fun. These weren't polite duels, they were full-contact brawls. And yes, there were rules, but they were more like guidelines. Once things got started, the crowd roared, and the dust flew. Nobody cared much who got knocked unconscious. Tournaments were status symbols. Winning one could earn you prize money, reputation, and the attention of powerful nobles. But that meant the competition was brutal. Knights trained for months just to survive one event. They customized armor, hired squires to strategize, and treated jousting like a professional sport, because it was. Lose badly, and your career could be over, or your neck, or both. There were no medical waivers, just a chance at glory, or a stretcher carried by panicking servants. The audience, of course, loved it. Nobles watched from canopied booths, sipping wine while men below shattered bones for their amusement. Ladies dropped handkerchiefs as tokens, fluttering symbols of courtly love that often ended up soaked in someone's sweat or blood. Bards sang about bravery, never about the guy who lost an eye and had to retire early to manage grain accounts. No one composed odes to dislocated hips or jawbones held in place with linen wraps. And if you died, well, it was called an accident, an unfortunate outcome in an otherwise spirited contest. Maybe your name got added to a list. Maybe a priest mumbled something over your body before they carted it off the field. But the event went on. The crowd kept cheering, and your squire quietly packed up your gear while avoiding eye contact. Tournaments were supposed to be practice for war, and they delivered on that promise right down to the casualties. So yes, tournaments looked glorious. Trumpets, pageantry, crowds. But underneath all that silk and song was a meat grinder. Knights entered to prove their strength, win honor, and impress their peers. Many left with cracked ribs, missing teeth, and a new respect for the kind of violence people were willing to watch for fun. It was war in costume, and it still hurt just as much. Every knight needed a horse. Not just one, actually. Several. A proper war horse, or destrier, for battle. A palfrey for travel. Maybe a rouncy for errands or backup. And all of them were expensive, temperamental, and just one bad step away from becoming a very noble source of glue. Knights loved to show off their horses like sports cars, but owning one was less about prestige and more about constantly managing a powerful, unpredictable beast that didn't care about your reputation and would absolutely throw you in front of an audience if it felt like it. Let's talk price. A trained destrier cost more than a small house. Raising and conditioning one took years, and only the best were suited for combat. They weren't just big, they were trained to bite, kick, and trample enemies on command. That also meant they could bite, kick, and trample you if they were in a mood. Feeding them wasn't cheap either. War horses needed oats, hay, grazing land, and constant attention. Traveling with one was like bringing along a spoiled, muscular toddler who could sprint 30 miles and destroy fences for fun. You couldn't just toss a saddle on and ride. Horses needed care. Their hooves had to be cleaned. Their tack needed checking. Their health monitored. Sore legs, cracked hooves, infections. One problem could take you off the battlefield faster than an arrow to the knee. And God help you if your horse went lame the day before a charge. Knights who lost their horses in combat were suddenly vulnerable, slow, and very killable. That's why backup horses were kept nearby, if you could afford them. And guess what? They didn't always cooperate. War horses could panic, bolt, or refuse to move in mud. They could rear unexpectedly, crushing anyone behind them. And they weren't quiet. Nothing says stealth mission, like a half-ton destrier snorting and stamping like it owns the place. Even experienced knights fell from the saddle. One loose strap, one bad landing, one unexpected duck, and you're flying through the air in 60 pounds of steel, praying your helmet doesn't rotate backward before you hit the ground. Training with your horse took hours daily. You had to build trust, coordination, and reflexes. That meant riding drills, jousting practice, and conditioning routines that left you sore and your horse grumpy. You weren't just a warrior. You were a part-time groom, trainer, and equine psychologist. And still, after all that effort, your horse could wake up on the wrong side of the stable and decide that today was the day it was going to break your leg. Oh, and travel? A logistical nightmare. Horses needed to rest, eat, and be watered constantly. They couldn't gallop all day, and forcing them meant injuries. You had to stop at inns, find pasture, or pay locals for space. Sometimes your mount got stolen, sometimes it wandered off, sometimes it got eaten by wolves, by enemy soldiers, or by the increasingly desperate troops camped next to you. Losing your horse wasn't just an inconvenience. It could end your career. You weren't a knight without one. You were just a guy in heavy boots. So no, your horse wasn't a majestic sidekick. It was a walking pile of gold coins with a temper, a fragile skeletal structure, and a habit of making your life harder. Yes, it helped you charge into glory, but it also got sick, got scared, and occasionally sat down in the middle of a field because it was done for the day. Owning one made you a knight. Keeping it alive made you a miracle worker. You've survived battles, duels, feasts, tournaments, and bad weather. You've outlasted archers, plagues, and political backstabbing. But then one day, while repairing your saddle or polishing your lance, you get a splinter. Tiny, forgettable, not even worth swearing over. And within a week, you're dead. Fever, swelling, unbearable pain, and finally silence. Not in a blaze of glory, not with your sword raised, but from a piece of wood. That was the terrifying reality of being a knight. Your armor could stop a sword, but it couldn't stop bacteria. In the medieval world, your body was basically a walking infection magnet. Every cut, scrape, blister, or bruise was a potential entry point for something that could kill you. No one understood germs. Clean bandages were a luxury. Antiseptics a fantasy. If you were lucky, someone would pour wine or vinegar over the wound. If you weren't, they'd smear it with a mystery salve made from moldy herbs, pig fat, or blessed dirt from a local shrine. Your chances depended less on medical knowledge and more on whether the local barber had washed his hands this month. Teeth were even worse. Dental care was non-existent. Toothaches weren't just miserable, they were lethal. An infected tooth could become an abscess. That abscess could spread. Before you knew it, the side of your face was swollen like a melon. Your jaw throbbed like a war drum, and your breath could kill small animals. Without surgery or antibiotics, the infection could move to your brain or bloodstream. The result? Death. Slow, delirious, entirely preventable. If you'd been born 700 years later, even minor joint injuries could spell doom. A twisted ankle might hide a fracture. A broken finger could become septic. You sprained your wrist, lifting a shield? Better pray it doesn't swell and rot. Knights put tremendous stress on their bodies every day, and most injuries went untreated. Pain was constant, joints inflamed, backs ruined, and once something got infected, there wasn't much to do except pray, sweat, and hope your squire knew how to dig a decent grave. Abscesses, boils, and infected blisters could all turn deadly. So could ingrown toenails, bug bites, or the occasional rat nibble if you slept too close to the floor. These weren't just inconveniences, they were a roll of the dice every time. Some knights died from battlefield wounds. Many more died from battlefield-adjacent wounds, the kind you didn't even notice at first until your arm turned purple and someone started asking if they should find a priest. And let's not forget tetanus, also known as lockjaw, caused by bacteria in soil, manure, and rusty weapons, which conveniently were everywhere. It could enter your bloodstream through the smallest nick. The symptoms were brutal: muscle spasms, inability to open your mouth, full body stiffness, and eventual respiratory failure. Imagine dying slowly while fully conscious, unable to speak or move. That was the medieval reward for stepping on the wrong nail. So yes, knights were trained killers, wrapped in steel and respected across kingdoms. But they were also vulnerable, fragile, and utterly at the mercy of microscopic threats they couldn't see or understand. You didn't have to fall in battle to die like a dog. Sometimes, all it took was a sharp sliver of wood and one very bad week. On paper, knights were paragons of Christian virtue. God-fearing, humble, protective of the innocent, and faithful to the teachings of the church. That's what the sermons said, anyway. But here's the catch. Those same sermons also told you to take up your sword, ride out, and murder a bunch of other Christians or non-Christians, depending on what mood the Pope was in that century. You weren't just a warrior. You were a warrior who had to pray before, during, and after committing legally sanctioned violence. Welcome to the moral gymnastics routine known as being a medieval knight. The contradictions started early. As a squire, you were taught to cross yourself before battle. You confessed your sins, received blessings, and sometimes even fasted before going out to cave someone's skull in. Knights knelt at altars in full armor, promising to defend the weak and uphold peace. Then they mounted their war horses and charged into villages, castles, or rival territories, spreading peace by setting everything on fire. God, apparently, was okay with that, as long as you said the right prayers afterward. The Crusades made it worse. Knights were told they could earn salvation by going to war in the Holy Land. That's right, kill enough infidels and you could skip purgatory. It was Christianity with a loyalty program. You still had to confess, but now your sins were reset every time you ran someone through for the right cause. It created a strange incentive structure. Be pious, then go kill. Feel guilty, then go kill more to feel less guilty. It was a theological loop-de-loop no one really wanted to examine too closely. But guilt still crept in. Some knights struggled with what they saw and did. Bloodshed wasn't always glorious. Dying soldiers screamed. Wounded men begged. Sometimes you realized the person you just killed wasn't an enemy at all, just in the wrong place. That's when the prayers got louder. Knights built chapels. They gave money to monasteries. Some even retired early and became monks themselves, trading swords for silence in the hope that God would forget all the times they accidentally burned a barn full of people. And don't forget confession. It was supposed to cleanse the soul, but it also became a revolving door for battlefield sins. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I slaughtered 5 men yesterday, but I did it with honor. The priest, often the same one who blessed the battle beforehand, nodded and told you to say some Hail Marys. You walked out forgiven, at least officially. But deep down, some part of you wondered if God was really keeping score. And if he was, how bad the final tally looked. Publicly, you had to maintain the image. Attend Mass, support the church, show humility at feast days. But privately, many knights hedged their bets. They wore relics, carried saints' medallions, and made donations to as many abbeys as they could afford, just in case. Some even kept pieces of holy wood in their scabbards or tucked into their armor. Because if divine favor was real, it couldn't hurt to be extra cautious, especially when you were swinging a sword in one hand and holding your soul in the other. So yes, you were supposed to be both devout and deadly, a holy man with a mace, a defender of virtue who knew 15 ways to open a skull. It was an impossible balancing act, and everyone knew it. The church needed warriors, but it also needed clean consciences. Knights were expected to provide both, or at least look like they did. Whether your faith was sincere or just insurance, that was between you and whatever saint you muttered to before charging into battle. You made it. Somehow, after decades of riding into battle, dodging arrows, and surviving tournaments, you're still alive. You're older now, slower, heavier, louder when you sit down. Your joints sound like firewood snapping, but at least you're finally done, right? Time to enjoy the fruits of your labor? Not exactly. Because for a medieval knight, retirement wasn't a reward. It was a slow descent into obscurity, debt, and the creeping horror of realizing that all your skills involve weapons and horses, and no one wants to pay for those anymore. First, there's the money problem. Knights weren't salaried. You were paid per campaign, maybe a cut of the loot, or land if your lord was feeling generous. But when the wars stopped, so did the income. You might have gained property during your service, but holding on to it meant constant management, taxes, and the looming threat of your neighbor deciding it looked better on his side of the fence. No pension, no savings, just the hope that your tenants didn't all die of plague and your horses didn't eat themselves into bankruptcy. And then there's your body. Every injury you ever ignored is now back for revenge. That old sword wound in your thigh? It flares up when it rains. The cracked rib from a tournament in 1327? It creaks like a barn door. Your hands shake, your back locks up, and your once proud posture now resembles a wilted coat rack. Armor doesn't fit. Riding hurts. You sit in your hall, if you have one, and watch the new generation rise, all bright-eyed and bendy-limbed, while you count the days until your joints finally mutiny. Socially, you're stuck in limbo. Too old for war, too stiff for court. Young nobles nod politely, but no one really listens. You're a relic, useful as a cautionary tale or a decorative title. Maybe they give you a ceremonial role, like judging a tournament or blessing a new squire. But the truth is, you're fading. The songs don't mention you anymore. The heralds mispronounce your name. Even your armor hangs in the corner like a ghost of the man you used to be. Some knights retired to monasteries, not out of piety, but necessity. Monks didn't ask questions, and the food, while terrible, was consistent. Others tried managing their estates, dabbling in local politics, or advising younger lords. A few became mercenaries again, riding out for one last campaign to pay for repairs on a crumbling manor roof. Because nothing says glory days like leading a ragtag force of farmhands and hoping your back doesn't give out before the looting starts. Family, if you had one, was your only buffer. A son to inherit your name, a wife to keep the books, daughters to marry well or enter a convent if things got tight. But even then, legacy was fragile. One bad harvest, one political shift, one accusation from a jealous neighbor, and everything could collapse. You could die broke, landless, forgotten. Not because you weren't brave, but because the world moved on and didn't leave forwarding addresses. So no, retirement wasn't peaceful. It was quiet, yes, but not the good kind. The quiet of empty halls, of unpaid debts, of distant memories that no one wants to hear. You lived your life by the sword, and in the end, you traded it for an aching back, a leaky roof, and the hope that someone, somewhere, might still remember you as more than a creaky old man who used to matter. Knights were supposed to be legendary, symbols of power, loyalty, and valor. The kind of men bards sang about and lords toasted at feasts. But the battlefield had a different opinion, because once you fell, Whether from a sword, a spear, or sheer exhaustion, you weren't a legend. You were just a name on a list. Maybe, if someone bothered to write it down. In truth, you were as replaceable as the horse you rode in on, sometimes less. It didn't matter how many campaigns you'd fought, how many banners you'd ridden under, or how shiny your armor had been last week. If you died in battle, someone else picked up your weapon. Your squire stripped your gear before your body cooled. Not out of disrespect, but necessity. Armor was expensive, so were swords. The war moved on, and so did everyone else. Your lord still needed fighters. The line couldn't stop just because one more knight joined the pile. And if you were wounded instead of killed, that wasn't always better. A crippled knight was a burden. You couldn't fight, couldn't ride, couldn't earn. You might get sent home, if you had a home to return to. Otherwise, you became someone else's responsibility, a limping reminder of battles gone wrong. The lucky ones found work as trainers or guards. The unlucky ones ended up begging outside the same castles they once defended, hoping for a crust of bread or a nod of recognition. Your legacy depended entirely on status. If you were rich, your family might fund a tomb. Maybe a priest would say your name every feast of St. Michael. If you were poor, your grave was a hole in the ground, and your story ended the moment your last squire stopped talking about you. Most knights weren't famous. They weren't even remembered. They were line fillers, spear fodder with fancy titles. The only people who mourned them were the ones left cleaning their blood off the tents. Even promotions didn't last. Rise high enough, and there was always someone waiting to take your place. A rival, a younger knight, a more charismatic sycophant. Knights were respected, but only while they were useful. The moment you became inconvenient, you were sidelined. No pension, no honor guard, just silence. Loyalty went one way. The system never paused to thank you. It just rolled forward, hungrier than ever. This wasn't just war, it was bureaucracy with swords. Knights were assets in a ledger, trained, equipped, deployed, and discarded. You might think your deeds mattered, but unless they served a bigger narrative, they were forgotten before the next campaign. You were part of a machine built to glorify the few at the expense of the many, and knights, for all their pageantry, were often just glorified infantry in better metal. So yes, you trained from childhood, you fought with honor, you served your lord, but when the final blow came, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a statistic. You were brave, sure, but so were the hundreds before you, and the hundreds after. Glory was fleeting, death was permanent, and your replacement was probably already polishing his boots. You spent your life inside it. Steel plate, chainmail, greaves, gauntlets, layer upon layer of defense against a world that never stopped trying to break you. It was hot, it was heavy, it hurt, but it made you a knight. It was your identity, your uniform, your shield against death and dishonor. And yet, at the end of it all, the truth was simple and hard to swallow. The armor didn't matter. Not really. Because when your time came, and it always came, the steel couldn't stop it. Not age, not disease, not betrayal, and certainly not time. The armor could hold back swords. Sometimes it could deflect arrows, occasionally, but it couldn't save you from a fever in winter. It couldn't stop your lungs from filling with fluid in a damp castle. It couldn't protect your joints from rotting after a decade in the saddle. It never warned you about bad decisions, or poisonous politics, or the way your own memory would turn on you when the glory faded. It was protection, sure, but only from the obvious things, the brutal ones, not the slow ones. And that's the cruel joke, really. You wore that armor for years, slept near it, bled inside it. You had it custom fit, repaired, polished for feast days. It was supposed to make you invincible. But underneath, you were just a man. Soft skin, aging muscles, fears you couldn't admit even to yourself. Armor didn't fix that. It just covered it up long enough to fool other people, or yourself, until it didn't anymore. When the armor came off, if it ever did, you were left with what? Scars. A limp, maybe a title. If you were lucky, maybe a bit of land. But the armor didn't follow you into retirement. It didn't keep you warm when the fire burned low. It didn't visit when you got sick. It didn't carry you to the chapel when your legs gave out. It stayed where it always had, silent, heavy, and empty. And the world moved on. The next generation came in swinging sharper swords, wearing newer mail, learning your lessons without your name attached. You became a story, then a whisper, then nothing. Because that's what time does. It files down even the sharpest edges. Even the best armor rusts. It crumbles like everything else. What mattered wasn't the metal you wore. It was what you carried inside it. Your loyalty, your grief, your moments of mercy. The things no bard ever sang about. So maybe the armor didn't matter. Maybe it never did. Maybe the weight you carried was never measured in pounds of steel, but in the choices you made, the things you stood for, the people you protected. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point all along. Not to be invincible, just to try. Even when it hurt, even when it failed. Especially then, because in the end, every knight hangs up the armor, every blade dulls, every name fades. But what you did when it still mattered, that's what lasts, if anything does. Not the armor, not the title, just the truth beneath it.